Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this week's video, I'm going to make over this little table that you can see in front of you now. I picked it up for £10 from a charity shop. I'm going to give it a makeover using Terra Clay Paint. As always, we're going to start with the boring bit, which is prep. It's necessary, but it can be boring. I'm going to take the original handles off and retain those because I'm going to put them back on later. And then I'm cleaning it with Dixie Belle's White Lightning, as always. And once it's clean, I'm then going to rinse it off with clean warm water and a clean cloth to get rid of any cleaning residue on the surface. And that ensures we've just got a nice, clean, blank canvas. There were a couple of little dings on the top, so I just went ahead and filled those with wood filler. And then I gave it a quick scuff sand with my electric sander. This piece was actually made up of a couple of different things. Some of it was wood and some of it was not wood. So I'm going to go ahead and scuff sand anyway, and then I'm just going to concentrate my area of scuff sanding particularly on this side panel because I'm using Terra Clay Paint and it does have very good adhesion on most surfaces. So my plan is to undercoat this in Moonbeam. So all I'm going to do is dab a little bit onto this side panel only, and then I'm going to leave it, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to do a scratch test, and I'm going to see whether it does require slick stick or not. Okay, so I've actually left this most of the weekend, not intentionally, but I just kind of ran out of time to get it done. So I'm going to do a bit of a scratch test now on this to see if it's going to hold up. Looks good, Bella. So we don't need to slick stick this piece. The Terra Clay Paint has gone on absolutely fine. So now I can crack on with the rest of the prep. I'm going to sand these two bits down that I filled on the top, and then I'm going to put a base coat of this Moonbeam colour, do you mind, all over the piece. So as I said before, this is not going to need slick stick, which is fabulous news. It just saves me a step. If I was using chalk mineral paint or if I was using silk all-in-one mineral paint, then I would be using slick stick because I know both of those paints very well, and I know that they would need that extra step to ensure adhesion. But Terra Clay Paint is still a relatively new paint, even to me, so I just wanted to double check that adhesion would be satisfactory before I went ahead and applied this paint all over the piece. So I'm stippling the paint on, which means I'm just sort of pouncing it over the surface because I want to create a little bit of texture and movement in this. If you didn't catch the colour first time round, this is the white in the Terra Clay Paint line, which is called Moonbeam. You can see how amazing the coverage is for a white. I'm going over a very dark surface with the white, and it is covering in one coat, which is phenomenal. So I let the Moonbeam dry thoroughly, and then I went in with the colour Cerulean Blue. Now, I don't have any rhyme or reason as to where I'm placing these colours, but I'm going for a tonal look, and I'm also going for kind of a layered look. I want a really pretty kind of boho finish to this. So I'm just playing around with placement at the moment. So the darker colour that you can see here is Blue Moon. And I'm also using a hairdryer to partly dry some of the paint as I go. Obviously that's just going to speed up the drying process and allow me to layer the paints and not have to wait for it to dry on its own in between. This lighter turquoise is called Lani's Lagoon, and to apply all of these paints I'm using a premium chip brush which has natural bristles. I'm not using any water, and I'm also using a very, very small amount of paint. I am also taking some of the paint off my brushes, so it's almost like a dry brush effect, and I'm just layering up the colours in that kind of really rough style. So as you can see, I have allowed that kind of first lot of layering to dry down, And now I'm going in with Blue Moon again, which is the deepest blue that I'm going to use. And I'm taking the majority of paint off my brush. I'm just adding a very, very small amount of paint to my bristles. This brush is completely dry. I'm not adding any water. When I add water, or if I added water to this, the colours would all kind of melt together. I don't really want that. I kind of want this to look like lots and lots of layers over the top of one another. So I'm using the darker blue to just add a little bit of shading around the drawer edges. So obviously this piece is quite flat. There aren't, apart from the drawer fronts, there's not really any detail to this. It's very square and has a lot of flat surfaces. So I'm going to use colour to add that little bit of dimension and shading, and I'm just building the colours up really, really softly and slowly until I get the look that I want. And you all know I'm a massive fan of contrasting colours. So I'm going to use the shade Daffodil, which is a super bright yellow. And I'm just going to add some in small areas for a sort of pop of colour. I'm using a natural bristle brush. This is actually a stencil brush because I ran out of natural bristle brushes. So I'm just using a stencil brush. And I'm adding a small amount onto my brush and taking it off onto a rag. And then just building up the coverage as much as I kind of want it, just in the certain areas, just to give it a little pop of colour and add a little bit of contrast. So as you can see, I didn't really stick to a plan of the colour placement. I am adding a little bit of the darker blue around the drawer edges and underneath the kind of lip of the top. But aside from that, I'm just sitting back and just assessing it as I go and just figuring out where I want colour, where I want to add more blue, where I want to add darker pieces, and where I want those pops of yellow. But what I will say is, if you do want to give this look a go and you're a little bit intimidated, stick with colours that are similar. So stick with tonal colours, so a couple of pinks or a couple of blues. If you are introducing contrasting colours, then it is slightly harder if you're a beginner to this kind of look than if you were to pick those 2 or 3 colours that are very similar to one another. So I'll just quickly show you what I did to the side. The sides were harder because it is just one flat panel. There's not really any detail to work with. Like the front has got the drawers, and it also has that carved detail on the drawer fronts, which is nice to pick out. The sides just had nothing. They were just blank sort of flat pieces. So I created some shadow around the edges to sort of add a little bit of dimension there. And I'm just basically working on blending that out into the centre so it's not a harsh line. But that's all I really did on the sides and the back. Terra Clay Paint distresses amazingly well. So I'm going to use a wet distress technique, and basically what that means is you apply a wet rag or cloth to the area that you want to distress, and it will remove the paint. And that is because Terra reactivates with water until it's sealed. So I'm just using a wet shop cloth, and I'm just going around the drawers and taking off some of that paint to kind of reveal the colours underneath. And then I went in with a really fine sanding sponge just to slightly pick out some of the detail on the drawer fronts, which is like a carved detail. And I'm just really carefully rubbing over the colours to basically, this is just going to reveal some of the layers underneath, and it also just softens the look as well slightly. So obviously you can see I've got patches of yellow and darker blue and lighter blue. This kind of just gets them to kind of melt all together. So then I used a sanding sheet off my Festool, and this is basically gonna take more of the paint off. So I'm just concentrating it on that carved detail, and the carved detail is actually real wood, so the drawer fronts are solid wood. So I'm just gonna distress back the paint to pick out some of the solid wood, and this is just going to help emphasize that carved detail and just bring it out a little bit more. And I really liked the way that it was contrasting against the blue, so I went ahead and distressed around the drawer edges just to take it back all the way to the wood, and also did the same on around the edges and down the sides. So I'm going to now seal it with Terra Tuff. This is my absolute favourite top coat for using over the top of Terra paint. And you'll notice that when you apply your top coat over the paint, it basically turns the colour of the paint when the paint is wet, if that makes sense. So your colours will basically come back to life, because what happens when Terra dries is that it dries it a lot lighter, and that's because of the clay content in it. So I'm using Terra Tuff, I'm using it with a synthetic brush, and I'm using a really, really light hand. The best piece of advice I can give you with Terra Tuff is to use very thin coats, use a light hand, and use a really good quality synthetic brush to apply it with. And as with applications of pretty much all top coats, it's better to try and do several thin layers of top coat rather than try and do one thick layer, because you're just going to get brush strokes, you'll get drips, and it'll just end up causing you lots more work down the line. And for the drawer sides, I decided to add some peekaboo detail, and this is why I couldn't do this video any sooner, because this obviously was only just released in the last sort of week or so, so I had to kind of sit on top of this content for a little while. But this is a brand new stencil design from Belle called When Life Gives You Lemons, and it is a really delicate, intricate stencil. It's got lots of detail, and for that reason I am using a spray adhesive. Now, I have had not much luck with a spray adhesive before, but we're going to give it another go. We're going to give it the benefit of the doubt and go again. So I have sprayed the back of the stencil. I then left it to go kind of tacky, and I think that's where I was going wrong before. I've laid it flat on the surface of the drawer side, and like I say, the reason I'm using this spray adhesive is not something that I use all the time, but this stencil is super detailed, and also it's quite big, and the size of my drawers is quite small, so I didn't want this to slide about all over the place while I was stenciling. So for that reason, I'm using the spray adhesive, and it actually worked very, very well. I got mine off Amazon. It's quite inexpensive. You can also get it from Hobbycraft and places like that. Just make sure it's a low tack and suitable for stencils. So Terra Clay Paint is actually the perfect paint for stenciling, and that is because it's super, super thick. So the texture is absolutely perfect for stenciling, and you don't have any risk of bleed through because it's really thick. So I'm just using the Belle Brush here from Belle, and I'm using the colour Cerulean Blue, which is a colour that obviously I used on the little side table. And I'm taking the majority of the paint off my brush onto a shop cloth, and then just pouncing it over the surface. So there's a couple of different techniques that you can use to apply the paint through a stencil. Tapping it like this, like I'm pouncing it, is one. You can also swirl it. Now, I found swirling doesn't work with this particular stencil design. Again, because it's super intricate and it's got a lot of details, what you can do is move that stencil around as you're swirling it. So I don't find that works particularly well with this. You can also use a roller, which does work really well because obviously it passes flat over the surface, but I'm just using a brush this time. One massive plus side of using this spray adhesive is not only that it keeps the stencil steady, but it also leaves your left hand free to do other things. So normally my left hand is holding the stencil down, and obviously it was free this time to do other things. And when I finished it, I sealed it with Terra Tuff, the same as the rest of the piece. And you know me, no project is complete without the addition of some waxing. So Best Dang Wax is not advised to seal Terra Clay paint because it's just not suitable because it's a water-based wax and it reactivates the paint. But because I've used Terra Tuff to seal, I can go ahead and use coloured waxes to add a little bit of detail. So I'm using Best Dang Wax in black, which you all know I use by the bucket load. And I'm using a premium chip brush just to feather that in. Again, this is just going to add a little bit of dimension around the drawer sides. Basically anywhere that I want to deepen the colour. So I'm just adding a little bit around the handle here. And I'm going to add some under the lip of the top of the table. Just anywhere that I want to add a little bit of shadow and dimension, I'm going to add Best Dang Wax in black. And then once it's been on the surface for about 20 minutes, I'm going to take a cloth and then just buff the excess off. And it just leaves a nice kind of amount of wax, just enough to kind of add those shadows and dimension. So you remember me saying at the start of this video I was going to use the existing handles, which I put back on, and they're perfectly functionable. They've just gone a little bit dull and dated in their age. So I am going to use gold Gilding Wax, which is an oil-based wax. It's also permanent, and that's just going to give them that little pop of gold that they need. And you can see I'm just tapping it all over. That's just going to give me a more kind of antique-y look rather than a very, very smooth look. I also decided to add a little bit of gold around the edges of the drawer. So I've already done the peekaboo detail on the drawer sides, and the drawer edges there was a sufficient gap between the edge for me to add extra product. So I'm just using my finger and applying gold all the way around the edges. And that's just going to add a little bit of detail, but it's only really possible if your drawers don't rub, or if they are really, really tight. It's probably not advisable to do this because obviously it will rub off eventually. And that's the finished piece. I don't have an official outro for you because it sold that quickly. I didn't have time to film one. But I've got some close-ups of the detail on the drawer sides and the drawer fronts there. And the finished shot, I just paired it with some pops of pink for a super fun vibe. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching as always. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments below. And make sure you hit the subscribe button.